If you're familiar with the Indiana Jones movies, then you might remember him as a fictional character who portrays an academic who embarks on action-packed adventures on quests to recover lost ancient relics. Well, did you know that there was actually an explorer who, in the early 1800s, embarked on a really risky adventure to the Middle East? While on this incredible journey from England all the way to Africa, he had to assume a false identity because back then there was some political turmoil in the region and locals weren't very welcoming of foreigners. So of course, in order to explore freely, this real-life academic had to assume a false identity as a Muslim Arab. Or else, if found out to be a foreigner in disguise, he could actually risk losing his life. And it would be on his way to Africa that he would actually unveil an ancient city, which is the lost city of Petra. And before I get into today's story, if you are someone who believes that sometimes fact can be stranger than fiction, and you would like to hear some awe-inspiring or totally unbelievable stories from history, then please consider tapping that like button and hitting subscribe for more stories. Okay, with that done, now let's get into today's story. It all started on November 24th, 1784, when Johann Ludwig Burckhardt was born in the town of Lausanne, Switzerland. And he was born to a wealthy family of silk merchants. Johann Ludwig Burckhardt also went by the name of Jean-Louis Burckhardt, but in this story, I'll just call him Johann for short. When Johann grew up, he actually went to university. And after graduating from university at the age of 22, Johann would actually go over to England to look for a job in the civil service. He would fail at getting that job. It would turn out to be a twist of fate for Johann because he would actually later gain employment at the African Association, whose stated mission was to, quote, help Britain beat France in the exploration of the African continent and exploitation of its riches. Now, at the time, the Niger River in Africa was unexplored territory to the Europeans. Now, Europeans were really interested in this river because it had a very unusual direction of flow. As most rivers would flow toward the ocean, the Niger River actually did the opposite. It would flow away from the ocean inland towards the Sahara Desert. Well, this would be the task that the African Association would give to Johann, was to explore the Niger River in order to better understand the strange and unusual direction of its flow. And in order to complete this task, Johann would have to make a trip from Cairo in Egypt all the way across the Sahara Desert to the city of Timbuktu in the country of Mali. Now, we in 2023 might think that this isn't such a difficult task. Why not just fly to your destination and start? But you have to remember, this is back in the very early 1800s. Back then, they didn't have airports, or air transportation to Africa wasn't like it is today. But Burckhardt was no hot-headed adventurer. In 1807, he would enroll at Cambridge University, where he would study Arabic, and he would learn some practical skills that he could use on his journey. And at that same time, he would start to learn to dress as the Arabians did. He put on long robes and put on a turban. If you remember, as I mentioned earlier, right, in the early 1800s, the Middle East was a politically sensitive region, and it wasn't very friendly to foreigners, especially European Christians. By posing as a Muslim, Johann would be in a better position to explore more freely, maybe access some unrestricted areas that were, closed off to foreigners, and he would be able to better understand the local culture, as speaking Arabic would enable him to converse with the local people and document his experiences more effectively. It was in February of 1809 when Johann would finally start his expedition. He embarked on his journey from England to Malta. Now you might be confused, like why would he stop over in Malta? Why not just go to Cairo? Well, back in the early 1800s, this would be more of a practicality because you see, early 19th century exploration was no walk in the park. Johann needed to prepare for his journey into the African continent, and Malta was a pit stop for the adventure ahead. And it was in Malta where Johann would adopt his new persona as a Muslim Indian merchant named Ibrahim ibn Abdallah. And during his time in Malta, Johann would learn of Dr. Ulrich Seetzen, who had left Cairo in order to search for a lost city named Petra. However, unfortunately, Dr. Seetzen was murdered before he could find the lost city. Now, this really piqued Johann's interest because this was the first time for him hearing about a lost city in the Middle East. And definitely, Johann wanted to find out more. So Johann would continue on his journey to his next stop in Aleppo, Syria. And it was actually in Aleppo where Johann would set up kind of like a temporary home. He would actually buy a house, and he was taking more Arabic lessons from a friendly Christian Arab who would invite him to smoke hubble bubbles together, which is, I looked it up, it was like a hookah, a sort of thing that they used to smoke tobacco. And Johann would spend his free time studying the Quran and learning the Muslim law, actually memorizing them by heart. And fast forward, after almost 2 years of living in Aleppo, Johann got comfortable enough in his new persona as a Muslim that he felt it was safe to travel around the area to the surrounding regions in Syria, Palestine, Lebanon. And he documented that on these trips, he would actually sleep on the ground and eat with the camel drivers. And Johann felt like he was having the time of his life. He got to visit ancient ruins in Damascus, Palmyra, Baalbek, and he was actually one of the first to discover the Hittite or Libyan hieroglyphs. In a letter to his parents, Johann would describe his seamless disguise into Arabian society as, quote, "You wouldn't recognize me, sitting on the ground in loose-fitting Turkish robes and sporting a respectable beard," end quote. But even though Johann was confident in his disguise, he felt like he had to take extra caution from being found out. In instances where he would have to make an entry into his journal, he would actually find a private spot away from any prying eyes, and he would take his journal out from under his turban and move his turban so it was to cover his hands as he was writing. You might ask, so what's the big deal? Why'd he have to be so secretive about keeping a journal? Well, it was because Johann had been robbed more than once by the people he actually paid for his protection. And if people saw that he was keeping a journal, it could raise suspicion. They might be curious as to what he was writing. The worst thing for Johann would have been for his journal to be taken away from him. Johann kept more or less details of his daily activity in his journals. He was a very passionate ethnologist, or a person who studies peoples and cultures. And in his journals, he documented the people he encountered and the political power relations in the places he visited. He recounted many stories in his journals of the challenges that he faced from the climate, the terrain, the people, but he was in constant fascination of his everyday experiences. Now, after living almost 3 years in Aleppo, Syria, Johann finally continues on to his next stop in his journey. At this time, he's around 28 years old, and he starts south towards Cairo. Johann knows his limitations. He knows that he's unfamiliar with the strange terrain, so definitely he has to hire a guide. But for some reason, his guide, instead of taking him on a more well-traveled route by the coast down from Syria to Cairo in Egypt, his guide decides to take him on a more inland route, which would take them through the desert of Jordan. Not long into this trip, it would turn out that Johann's guide didn't have good intentions for him. because it was while they're traveling through the desert in Jordan that Johan's guide would actually end up robbing him and abandoning him in the desert alone. And of course, Johan has like nothing with him. He's been robbed. He has no food, no water. He is by himself, just left to die basically in the middle of the desert. But in a miraculous twist of fate, Johan would stumble upon an encampment in the desert who would turn out to be a group of desert nomads known as the Bedouins. The Bedouins are actually a nomadic Arab tribe who have lived in the desert and survived for generations. So of course, Johan would hire a new Bedouin guide who would take him to continue on his journey south towards Cairo. Now, as Johan continued his trip through the desert with his new Bedouin guide, who actually, side note, his Bedouin guide brought his flock of sheep and goats with him, which I thought was pretty cool and fun, but that doesn't impact the story in any way, so back to the story. So as they were trekking through the desert together, the Bedouin guide would tell Johan of a story of an ancient city that was located in the valley called Wadi Musa, which translates to the Valley of Moses. It said that in this valley was where Moses used his shaft to strike a rock and water gushed forth out of the rock. And it's also believed that through this valley was the site of the tomb of Aaron, who is said to be Moses's brother. So the Bedouins considered this place a very sacred site. Now, when Johan heard this, it immediately piqued his interest. Because if you remember earlier, Johan had heard of Dr. Ziethen, who was searching for an ancient lost city called Petra. And Johan had a nudging feeling that this could be the ancient lost city that Dr. Ziethen was searching for before he died. Now, as Wadi Musa, or the Valley of Moses, wasn't located on their track, like they weren't gonna go by it, it was actually off the beaten path and they would have to make a detour. Of course, Johan definitely, he needs to explore this location. He needs to find out. I mean, it is on his to-do list. So how would he get there, as he has not been there before, and the only way there is to ask his guide without arousing any suspicion. Because you see, the Bedouins consider this site as very sacred to them. They do not take any outsiders there. It's a place where, like, if you know it, you know it. If you don't, I mean, good luck finding it. It's very sacred to them. They keep it ultra guarded. I mean, especially top secret from foreigners, because foreigners were thought to be like only treasure hunters, like seeking to make profit or maybe steal treasures from the area. Definitely no foreigners allowed. So Johan had to be very, very conspicuous in his reason why he wanted to go to Wadi Musa. I mean, if Johan was found out to be actually a European foreigner in disguise, he could have his journal taken away, he could be attacked, or even worse, he could actually be killed. Now, Johan smartly, remember, he is totally in disguise as a Muslim Arab, and he tells his Bedouin guide that he has vowed to sacrifice a goat at the tomb of Aaron. And in order to complete his vow, his guide must take him there. Now, hearing this, his Muslim guide is like, oh great. Of course, the Bedouins, this is their top secret site. They do not want to take anyone there who has no knowledge of it previously. But I mean, Johan, he's like, I've taken a vow as a Muslim, I have to do this. The Bedouin guide, he's like biting his teeth, but he can't refuse. So even though it would be reluctantly, but Johan's guide definitely came through, and on August 22 of 1812, he would guide Johan to the eastern entrance of Wadi Musa. Now, Johan is being led by his guide through a very narrow, like, slit in the sandstone mountains. It's like, it's a very dark gorge that at some places could be only about 3 meters wide, so it's pretty narrow. And he's led through it for about over a kilometer. He's walking for around half an hour. And all along, Johann notices that there are channels or water channels cut into the sides of the mountain or the sides of the path he's walking, which he, hypothesizes this could be like channels leading water into the ancient city. And actually, as we now know it today, this narrow gorge that leads into the ancient city is now called the Sick or the Seek. Now, as Johann would emerge out through the gorge on the other side, he would be completely awestruck as he first laid his eyes on a monumental structure that is completely ancient. Now, the first structure that Johann would actually lay his eyes upon is nowadays called the Treasury, and it is a 30-meter high building that is actually carved into the side of the rose red colored cliffs. And it actually resembled Greek architecture from Alexandria. Now, Johann would go into detail in his journal about his discovery that day. He would write of Petra, quote, "The natives call this monument Kasr Farun, or Pharaoh's Castle, and pretend that it was the residence of a prince. But it was rather the sepulchre or place of burial of a prince, and great must have been the opulence of a city, which could dedicate such monuments to the memory of its rulers," end quote. Though Johann's descriptions of what he saw at the ancient city of Petra that day didn't contain any names of like Petra or the treasury or the theater or anything like that, but his descriptions clearly describe the now well-known tombs and monuments at the site. Johann definitely, he wanted to explore every nook and crevice of Petra, but his guide was starting to get suspicious, like he was lingering around for a little bit too long. And so his guide would finally kind of push him on through the valley, away from the ancient ruins of Petra. They would continue on towards the tomb of Aaron. And as it was starting to get dark, Johann would make his sacrifice to the tomb of Aaron by sacrificing the poor goat. And as it turned nighttime, Johann's guide would take Johann back to their track to Cairo. So though Johann did not find any names on the ruins that day, Johann was convinced that it was the same ruins that Dr. Seetzen was looking for. Now, how could such a monumental-sized city pop up in the middle of nowhere? It is in the middle of a desolate desert. Why would someone build a city in the middle of the desert? The Petra story starts with the Nabateans, who are a group of desert nomads. They were skilled travelers who herded camel, sheep, and goats and had no permanent home. As the trade market grew in the region, so did Petra. Hauling heavy loads across the vast and barren desert is a risky and tough job. And for a price, the Nabateans provided food, shelter, and water at settlements located along the trade route. And they also charged tolls for foreign traders who crossed into their territory. Around 200 to 50 BC, they would actually leave their nomadic lifestyle behind and form the city of Petra at the crossroads of different trade routes. The Nabateans controlled trade routes among most of the incense road, all the way from southern Arabia through Petra up to Gaza. And all their profits paid for the Nabatean state, including the capital of Petra. So in essence, Petra became an essential trade hub. And as traders from around the world came through Petra, they brought their ideas and their culture from places like Egypt, China, Greece, and India. And the Nabatean civilization would be one of the most powerful in the ancient world. And at its height, at around 50 AD, the city of Petra was the capital of the Nabatean Empire, with as much as a population of 20 to even 30,000 people. Petra is filled with spectacular tombs, monuments, and dwellings that are carved into the sandstone cliffs. These elaborate buildings were actually carved by hand. Then they were covered with stucco and painted bright colors. When one enters the city of Petra through the Siq, you first lay eyes upon the treasury, which it turns out was actually created as a tomb. Another one of Petra's best-known rock-cut monuments is the monastery. It's actually an unfinished tomb facade. Many of the tombs of Petra have elaborate facades and are now used as dwellings. Now, despite its location in the middle of the desert, Petra was actually an oasis. And you might ask, well, how did they actually manage to make it an oasis? How did they get water there? Well, the Nabateans were actually experts at living in the desert, and they knew how to get water to their town. They actually created a really clever system of terraces, channels that brought the water into the town, and cisterns used to store water. And this water was used to grow their crops. They even had rock-cut channels that, if you might remember, when Johann was walking through the Siq, he mentioned in his detailed journal that he saw these water channels alongside the Siq. And the Nabateans also had pipes to bring water from the springs around the city into the city. And the Nabateans would actually use underground cisterns to store water and keep it from evaporation or potential enemies. It would be this mastery of water that would allow Petra to thrive in the desert. And actually today, the Bedouins, remember those nomad tribes that are still living in the desert? They actually still use those same cisterns that were built over 2,000 years ago. Now, as Petra was flourishing, the Roman Empire at the time was actually expanding its boundaries and taking over, acquiring new lands. And it would be in 106 AD that the Romans actually conquered and took over Petra. But it did appear that the takeover of Petra was peaceful and life in Petra continued as normal. But as we saw earlier, the takeover by the Roman Empire actually left a remarkable mark on the empire through its architecture, as you can see from the columns, staircases, and those statues. Actually, you can also see the Roman influence on the city's design and its public spaces. The Romans actually built new roads as well, like the impressive colonnaded street that runs through the center of Petra. Lined with massive columns, this long straight street was unlike anything else in the city. So Rome would actually rule Petra for the next 300 years, and Petra's fate would actually be kind of tied to the Roman Empire. Eventually, Rome moved the center of trade northward and closer to the coast. And the Roman Empire actually turned to shipping by sea for most of its trade. Therefore, Petra's importance as a trade hub began to fade. A major turning point in Petra would happen when a huge earthquake hit in 363 AD. And this earthquake caused major damage to the city's structure and also its water supply system. According to historical records, about half the city was wrecked by this earthquake. So fast forward, around the late 300s AD, the Roman control of Petra would start to crumble, and it would be in the early 600s AD when Muslim Arabs arrived and Petra came under Islamic rule. By 700 AD, around there, only a few people were still living in Petra. Fast forward to the 12th century, Petra would actually become a post for the Crusaders. The Crusaders actually built fortresses, but eventually after the Crusaders left Petra, it kind of faded away from the world, and the locals kept it a secret location, especially from the Western world. So no Europeans would actually lay eyes on the city of Petra until Johann would show up in 1812. Now back to Johann's story a bit. After he had actually rediscovered Petra and unveiled it to the Western world again, his journey actually didn't stop there. He continued on his trek. So Johann was on his way to Cairo, right, when he discovered Petra. He eventually did reach his destination in Cairo in September of 1812. And over the next year, he would spend his time exploring the region in Cairo. And it was actually in March of 1813, when he was just doing his normal exploration of the area, where he would actually stumble across a pretty major, ancient discovery, he would actually stumble upon some sand-covered columns that turned out to be the monumental ruins of the Great Temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel. Now, if anyone knows anything about archaeology, this is one of the major archaeological discoveries. It would turn out that Johann wasn't able to fully excavate the site because it was almost completely covered in sand, and he wasn't prepared for this. This was not on his to-do list. And it was this friend of his who would actually return later on to do a full excavation of the ruins of the temple and would be credited with the discovery of it. Now, unfortunately for Johann, his plan to cross the Sahara Desert to get to Timbuktu and do his research on the Niger River, his plans would never materialize. Fast forward to 1817, Johann has been spending his time around the Cairo region, and he's just waiting for like a caravan or something to take him across the Sahara Desert, but this opportunity actually never comes for him. And during this time, he would fall ill multiple times to food poisoning, or as they called it, dysentery. And tragically, Johann passed away in October of 1817 at the tender age of 32, most likely due to food poisoning or dysentery. He was buried as a Muslim in Cairo, and his tombstone actually bore the name that he assumed during his travels in Arabia, which is Ibrahim ibn Abdallah. After Johann's passing, the first archaeological excavation of Petra didn't happen until 1929. And today, Petra is one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world. Further excavations in 1993 actually revealed more temples and tombs and monuments that can help us understand a little bit more about the social and political and religious traditions of the ancient city of Petra. But still, only 5% of the city has been uncovered so far, and there are still many mysteries that remain. As Petra is one of the most visited attractions in the Near East, in the 1960s, the local government actually forced the Bedouins to relocate off of the Petra area in order to better profit off of the tourism there. However, it's this abundance of tourist traffic that is actually posing a threat to the site. And add to that the threat from floods and other natural phenomena, the site of Petra is in serious risk of disintegration. However, in 1985, Petra was finally designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and now there are ongoing efforts in order to preserve the site for future generations. And that's it for today's story. If you got something out of this video, please leave a like. And if you're a fan of stories that are along the lines of the truth can be stranger than fiction, then please consider subscribing to my channel for more videos.